I'm sorry, we did not get your name.
After the tone, please state your name, followed by the pound sign.
I'm sorry, we did not get your name.
After the tone, please state your name, followed by the pound sign.
This conference is in silent mode.
There are 42
parties in conference, including you.
Most importantly, what to do and not to do when you're dealing with a potentially violent person. So hopefully by the end of this training, you'll have a better understanding of workplace violence, what contributes to its existence, and common characteristics of someone who might commit a violent act, and then warning signs of what to look for and how to protect yourself. I'll let you read what's on the slide, but unfortunately these statistics are still true that that there is a lot of workplace violence in our society, and people are exposed to it, hence the reason why your company is asking for this training and why they take it seriously. The one thing I want to point out is the very last statistic on the screen is that 20% of attackers in workplace are current employees, 7% are bosses or supervisors, and only 3% are former workers. We often think, of the disgruntled employee coming back to the job after he's been, quote-unquote, wrongfully fired, that is the majority of people who are violent. But the statistics prove elsewise is that those people who are actually currently employed in a company are potentially the most violent. So please keep that in mind. So, what is violence? I'll let you read what it says on the screen, but we usually think of violence as a physical assault or a physical act, but violence can also be actions that are less physical, including threatening words or gestures that assault a person's sense of safety or security. So it's the whole combination, and sometimes those gestures and those innuendos lead up to someone's safety being at risk. So that is what violence, an attack on a person's safety, security, physical or emotional well-being, which includes bullying, through the use of threats, threatening behavior, actual acts of violence. So let's talk about the factors that lead to violence. It's really important to understand that violent behaviors in the workplace are not isolated acts. They build the frustration and the potential for an act of violence to occur. The setting is right, the timing is right, they actually build in a workplace. They require an individual who lacks sufficient personal control to control his or her own choices of actions. There has to be a triggering event or a stimulus that pushes that person over the edge from just thinking they're angry to thinking about violent ways to harming someone or something. And there has to be an environment in which the violent action is possible. So those three factors have to merge together. The fire has to be available to ignite for a violent act to happen in a workplace. Let's talk about what types of workplace violence situations there are, and I'll let you read through the screen. But they lead from anywhere from attacks on people, which could be homicides, assaults, or sexual assaults, attacks on property, vandalism, property damage, harassment, stalking, bullying, racial or sexual harassment, and then threats, verbal or psychological abuse, intimidation or extortion, and then terrorists, bombing, shootings, or arson. Obviously, all of these take their toll on us. If you've been a victim of violence at workplace or in the community, that can be a lingering feeling and memory of that incident, or even hearing it on the news, like recently what happened in Boston. So the efforts of an organization to prevent violence have to include preventing all the actions that occur in the workplace. If there is harassment or bullying in the workplace, this can lead to something else. This actually creates an environment where the potential for greater danger is going to exist. So the potential for violence has to be nipped in the bud, so to speak. The earlier that someone recognizes, someone reports that there's bullying or someone's intimidating, the sooner an organization can be aware that they have the potential for more violence of a greater level to happen if it's gone unrecognized. So let's talk a little bit about factors for workplace conflict. These are the factors that increase the level of conflict that comes in the workplace. With an increased level of conflict, the potential for violence increases. Things like stress on the job, stress at home, help create the potential for conflict in the workplace. It's also important to understand that substance abuse is often a common element in violent acts. So if you read through this list, violence in society spills over the workplace. So, as in, if there's domestic violence at home, it can be brought to the workplace. Job-related stress, stress relating from massive layoffs, downsizing, that affects someone's security at work. Then there's a high correlation between violence and substance abuse. We know that people who are under the influence of substance abuse, their mind and thinking is altered because it is a brain disease when someone is addicted to drugs or alcohol, that the rational part of the brain is not engaged when someone is actively using substances. And then unaddressed or resolved personality conflicts that may spill over into workplace, and then obviously family and marital problems that may spill over into the workplace. I'll check and make sure that there are any questions after we go through the screen. So if you're thinking about a question that you have, you can feel free to go ahead and add it to the chat box. But let's talk about this slide. What's interesting about this slide is that you can start at the top where it says troubled worker and go left or right to see how violence produces in combination, how it escalates. I'm going to kind of read through this, but again, you can go either way and you get back to the same point that you have a troubled worker. This is when a potential problem turns into the kinds of workplace violence that we see on the news or read about in the paper. And it, as we mentioned before, just like lighting a fire, it does take a combination of things, but it usually starts with a troubled individual. We're going to talk about the profile of a troubled employee or troubled individual in the next slide. So this individual is usually struggling along until he hits a period of very high stress. His cup is full. He doesn't know what to do with his stress. It may be family problems. It may be work problems. It might be drug or alcohol problems that are getting worse. And all of these, a combination. And the individual starts to deteriorate under the stress of all of it. He doesn't have enough coping skills to know how to sort through his stresses and which one to tackle. So they're just in this big old ball or a lump in his stomach, and it's just growing and growing and growing. The person may have a history of solving problems with force or violence and intimidation, but always but almost always the individual has a sense that weapons will increase how effective the force or the violence or intimidation will be. So that's always part of their thinking pattern. The person also may have some familiarity with weapons. He might own them himself or know very quickly how to get them. And usually there's not a good enough support system to help that person with stress. Or he's estranged from that support system, or he's kept it a secret, or he is totally isolated. This person is going to push away or alienate people that may have support him or could support him. Because in some part, they may not want to be talked down, but they just don't want to engage and get some help. They don't see any way out but to continue on this path of destruction. If there's been recent incidents of violence in the news, that can give the individual some ideas about using violence as a way to solve problems. The individual won't focus on the negative aspects of the news flash, but rather look at it at how to actively how the revenge was taken, or how much publicity or notoriety that other person got, and maybe secretly want that notoriety or publicity for himself. If someone works at an organization that doesn't know how to handle violence or has let people get away with things in the past, or has threats and intimidation, harassment, or other kinds of violence happening in the workplace, then that individual is not going to be helped by an organization to control this growing problem. What I'm saying is, if someone's gotten away with bullying, making intimidating remarks, the organization is part of the problem because they haven't stopped it. So the combination, what I want you to hear is the combination of all these things happening in an organization is very rare. But however, even when you have a few of these situations, a troubled worker, someone who knows about weapons or can get them easily, it doesn't mean that troubled employee is going to take a big step to acting out. Most people don't. Most people do not, even under very bad circumstances. However, the reason for this training today is the potential is always there, and your organization wants you to know of what to report, how to protect yourself, and if you are in a situation like this, what to do and what not to do. So your organization does want to avoid everything it can to these problems escalating. Okay, let's see if there's any questions right now, and I don't see any. So feel free to ask some as we go along. We're going to continue on, and I'll keep checking to see if there's questions. So, what is the profile of a workplace violence perpetrator? I'm going to go through these, but please be aware that most people who fit in this profile will never commit acts of workplace violence. And some people commit acts of workplace violence won't fit in this profile. However, where this profile has been taken from is from history over and over again of what usually or who usually is a workplace violence perpetrator. So they're usually Caucasian. They're almost always male. They're socialized. They're isolated or a loner. They don't interact with people and they keep to themselves. They have an interest in weapons or symbols of power or authority. There's criminal record, usually none or minor violations. Most people say, wow, I wouldn't have thought that. But they probably don't have a history because nothing's really come together till this point to get them over the edge. Mental status, often a suspicious or mistrust of others. They're self-centered and they have low self-esteem. So they don't look outward of how this would affect others, but mostly what they can get from it. Most of the time we think that the people who are perpetrators in the workplace are, quote-unquote, the crazy ones that commit the acts. But those folks who are very paranoid or very scared, they're really more scared of other people versus doing harm to others. The person who commits the violence in the workplace is more likely to be sane, but they're going to isolate themselves from others because they don't want to be connected with people. They don't look at other people's needs. They look at what they can get out of it. And although the person who commits the workplace violence may not have any criminal record, they usually have a history of trying to solve problems through intimidation or other ways of power. Often they're the bully that started from, young age on. Okay. Okay, I'm going to move on here. I'm just kind of taking a peek at the questions. Okay. So let's look at the profile of a workplace violence perpetrator in a little bit more detail. You can read on the screen that the developmental factors, as I mentioned, they're emotionally detached. They're also victims of abuse. People who become violent in the workplace often come from homes where there was sexual or emotional or physical abuse themselves, or they've been involved in situations where they were witnessed violence. Historical factors, history of disliking authority. Again, they're not looking to connect, see the authority as out to get them. History of making threats, being violent or aggressive. Social factors, they're often drawn to groups that support the use of violence or worship power. These could be gangs. These could be groups like KKK that are bounded by social identity issues. And then finally, they intimidate persecutors to violence, recent deterioration in the work or home life, as we mentioned before. This brings up even more of a possibility of looking at getting back. And I'm just going to take a second here before I move to the next screen just to read something real quickly. And then we're going to move on. Okay. If you'd like for me to answer a question, please, just put your question in the chat box, and I'll look for it, and I'll see the question mark, and I'll repeat it to the rest of the audience, and we'll go from there. All right. So we've got several slides of employee warnings of what could potentially become violence in the workplace. However, not very often is this going to happen. But these are some of the signs that will show up in that troubled employee prior to an incident of workplace violence. So if you're a manager or if you're an employee who works with lots of other employees and you're concerned about someone, you may want to take this forward if you see someone who has a lot of these signs. And then the further we go down this list, the more an organization should be concerned that there is a potential for problems. As an individual begins to move increasingly aggressive approaches to problem solving, it's time to be more concerned. That is, as they move down this list, their rational thinking is getting less and less, and the potential for violence is more and more. Hopefully these all make sense to you. Someone finds emotional problems, reacting poorly to criticism, self-righteous anger or indignation towards people who disagree, and then again moving down the list, bizarre obsessive thoughts, sudden behavioral changes for the worse, and then evidence of increased stress level that you don't hear the person saying, I'm getting help, I'm managing my stress, or, I'm going to take a vacation. They're not looking at rational ways to deal with the extra stress. Okay, so let's look at some more warning signs. So additional warning signs would be poor performance conduct violations, a knowledge of alcohol, drug abuse, or dependency. Again, further down the list in this, the more dangerous it is if someone has a history of making threats against coworkers in the past. But do keep in mind that even though these signs and symptoms show up, that doesn't mean someone's going to commit workplace violence. However, we all need to be conscious of these possible signs and report it to authorities if we see a pattern. These are behaviors that cannot be ignored. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit more and then talk about what an organization should do when there is a perceived workplace violence type person in the organization. And in general, hopefully an organization has policies in place that say what their actions should be depending on what the person is doing. If the person is bullying, what reprimands need to be done for that. If they've made threats, do they need to get law enforcement involved? So there should be some policies in place to help an organization to deal with someone who is perceived as who has the signs and symptoms, a lot of them, that it could insinuate, it could cause potentially a workplace violence situation. So this is continuing on. We looked at the signs and symptoms. We looked at what I call the fire. You have to have the catalyst. You have to have at least the person who doesn't know how to handle the stress. You have the situation where he, quote unquote, knows he can get away with an act of violence, and access to weapons or other ways to harm people in the workplace. So three things have to come together. But now we're going to look at what's called the stages of escalation. And the higher up the list on this, obviously the more dangerous. So we're going to start at the bottom of this list with who could be potentially violent employee. At the lowest list, the employees are going to express his or her difficulties with these behaviors. They may not listen. They may be passive aggressive. They may be argumentative, or they may take active opposition to something. But they're only minimally going to infringe their rights on others. So they're just seen as grumpy and just argumentative and just hard to deal with. That's an employee going to say, oh, know him. He's just always in a bad mood. That's that employee. Moving up the ladder, at the moderate risk, this employee increasingly begins to exhibit behaviors that do infringe on other people's rights, not in ways that are physically dangerous, but in ways in which emotional or psychological damage is intended. Some legal remedies might be available to help a victim of these behaviors, but violations of this sort are hard to prove. So that's the staring, the glaring, the leering, verbal intimidation or threats, psychological abuse. Nothing is really said, but it's that sense. So that's what makes it difficult to call someone on the carpet, so to speak, or get legal involved. Some warnings, turning these leering their actions into behavioral is the symptoms or signs is the best an organization can do. Is that Tom was standing 2 feet from my cubicle and stared at me for 30 seconds before asking his question. Okay, that could be seen as intimidating. When we move up to the high risk, another threshold of safety is crossed when a person's judgment or control is insufficient to stop them from more active behavioral threats to another person's safety. Sabotage or stalking are still not direct physical threats to a person's safety, but the level of psychological intimidation is raised, and the level of violation to another person's rights is also elevated. Legal remedies here are more easily available at this level of risk. And then finally, the last threshold is when the behavioral threats move to direct assaults on another person's physical being. With the crossing of this level, the level of risk is very high, obviously. And I do have a question. I've got a couple of questions. We have a question that says, who should we report people with warning signs to? That's a very, very good question. You would want, after this training, you would want to go back to your supervisor and ask them, if you ever have concerns, I would think the first person we take it back to is your supervisor. Make sure that that's the right person. And then he would take it to the authorities in your organization and would know the powers. But it's always good for you to know that as well. Let's say your supervisor isn't there. Who in HR, Human Resources, or in your safety department would you go to, or security would you go to let someone know that there is a dangerous situation that you're concerned about? So I would always start with your supervisor, but you may want to ask, if you're not here, who should I go to? Okay, good question. All right, so now we've gone up the ladder, and now we're looking at the signs that violence may be imminent, and this is where it becomes dangerous. I'll let you be reading through this, but it's very important for employees to know when the level of the risk is reaching a point where violent behavior may become imminent. With an employee who has this history of violence risk factors that we've discussed, including prior violent behaviors, these are some of the indicators that may indicate that a violent episode may be close to occurring, such as the rapid breathing, clenched fists, talking loud, shouting, chanting such as, I'm going to get you, I'm going to get you, or if they're pacing or slamming their fist down, those repetitive movements, that's kind of revving them up, if you think of it that way. Aggressive actions, getting in someone's face or staring and leering and just not letting go of that. Asking frequently unreasonable or inappropriate demands that just don't make sense. That to the logical person, we wouldn't ask that. Again, the rational part of someone's mind when they get to this point is not working. It's back to what I call the caveman thinking. And if you think of a caveman, the caveman was either going to be eaten or he was going to get his prey. And so the violent person is in that mode that they don't want to be eaten, so they're going to attack first. Hopelessness, suicidal tendencies that may or may not come out or be said. And then they go from a highly agitated to an excited state to extremely calm. That's a very a warning sign that the storm is about to brew. They're kind of revving up energy again. So please be very aware if you've experienced this and make sure that it is reported. So let's begin to talk about what not to do in a potentially violent situation. I'm going to repeat all these things on the screen because I think they're very important to remember and keep in mind, because when you are faced with this situation, you may freeze or feel very frightened, and you may not know how to react. So if you know in your mind and remember these, hopefully that will help you. When someone is yelling and screaming at you, you don't want to raise your voice or react in anger. You want to stay as calm as possible. If they're wanting to engage you in an argument, don't. Just listen to them, hear their story over and over again, and just say you understand, even if you don't understand, but you're not going to get in an argument with them. Don't turn the situation into a power struggle, which goes right into the same thing about argument. That's the last thing you're going to do if you create a power struggle or you're arguing. You're adding fuel to the fire. And then don't make promises you can't keep. So you may say, I don't know, I'm just here listening, and remind them that you want to try to begin to work with their rational mind and show them the consequences if they keep going down this violent behavior. So let's talk about that a little bit here. All right, so we're still talking about what not to do. You don't want to be alone with this person as long as possible. Sometimes that can't be helped. If you feel you're in a violent situation and you're alone, make sure that you are as close to the exit of the room or space as possible. Don't put them between you and the exit. Don't touch the person. Even if you are a touching type person who wanted to tap someone on the shoulder and say, you know, I'm here, I'm listening to you, refrain from doing that. You can keep your hands open and let them know that you're listening versus closing them against your chest, but don't reach out and touch them. Again, don't place yourself or the person in a small confined area like a corner. You want to get as to the biggest space as you possibly can. And again, stay away from a room that contains anything that could be used as a weapon. And if you are in a room that, let's say, has a very heavy lamp, or that's the first thing that came to my mind, something else that could be used as a weapon, you want to move as far away from that thing that could be used as a weapon as you possibly can. Okay. All right. So we've talked about what not to do, and we're now going to move on to how to try to get the person who's potentially violent back into rational thinking and diffuse the situation. But the most important things about this, when you're looking at this, is to avoid putting yourself or anyone else in unnecessary danger. You want to try to prevent the situation from further escalation, and if possible, calm the situation down. And then, like I mentioned before, you're trying to help the person reestablish a sense of connection, both in connection to his work, his group, the company, however you can help him get connected to something bigger than him, and help him to look at, the consequences if he carries out with anything, violent or anything that could be perceived as violent. You want to get him back connected to reality. So, as it says, you're going to keep your composure and remain calm. That might mean taking a lot of deep breaths. You're going to maintain respectful but not aggressive eye contact. And as much as possible, though inside you may be very scared, make your eye contact as comforting and calm as possible versus frightened. Again, not be judgmental. Don't get into arguments. Acknowledge their feelings and offer assistance. Don't accept blame for the situation, and don't make promises you can't keep. You want to hear the story. Let them hear it out. Let them run it out. That de-escalates someone by just getting it out of them. And tell them that you are hearing them. And then be patient, reassure the person of your concern. And then, again, as we just mentioned, help them look at the potential consequences if they take this action, if they and help them get back reconnected to reality. Some more ways to diffuse a potentially violent situation is, I'm going to read through these again because I think they're very important to remember and hear as we talk about them, is avoid any behaviors that may lead to escalation of a problem. That we've already talked about it, telling the person they're crazy, yelling at them, arguing, doing a power struggle, making sudden movements. Don't let your guard down, though. Always be very aware of your surroundings. Obviously, you want to keep a safe distance from the person and leave that escape route. As you know, look how you might have to get out of the room or space very, very quickly. And try to remove the situation from a public audience. Now, that may seem counterintuitive, that you want other people to be around. But that puts more people in danger if he may be more violent. So you have to kind of weigh that situation out. If there are people there who might be able to take action and quickly leave the scene without the person who's violent or potentially violent noticing, great. But he may draw more fire in from more people being there. If you can get out of the situation and calm down, obviously you want to call security as quickly as you possibly can. And then obviously you want to report all incidents. You don't want to engage in ever cover-ups or anything like that because this situation is very, very dangerous. Not reporting incidences or engaging in cover-ups will eventually increase the risk of violence. Remember, we talked about the person can get away with it, and there's an opportunity to do so, and the organization doesn't react and there's no consequences, they're going to up the ante next time. Without reasonable consequences for their behaviors or intended behaviors, the wrong message goes out to the potential perpetrator. The potential perpetrator will then start to believe that the violence is a viable option for getting for what he wants in the future. So please keep that in mind. So I just asked you not to cover it up or not to, withhold information, but let's talk for just a second why employees might not report workplace violence. In reading these, I'm hoping this training and just us discussing this will help to increase your awareness of the reasons of the need to report the incidents so that your organization can take the steps it needs to take to keep you and others safe. Sometimes people don't report violence or potential violence because they're afraid of what the person might do back to them. There might be some lack of trust in the organization or management or systems. But if they don't know about it, how can you get them to respond? Concern that reports won't be taken seriously. An organization needs to look at reports that are given to them, and in most cases, investigation is done. So I would hope that you feel like you work in an organization that if you came and said that you were concerned about someone's behavior, that your company would take it seriously. Reporting procedures are confusing or difficult to use. Again, after this training, go to your supervisor and say, if there's a potentially violent situation, and do I bring it to you? And if you're not here, who should I bring it to? Another reason employees don't report workplace violence is wanting to protect the offender. There's lots of reasons behind that, but hopefully you're not going to be in that situation, and you want to make sure that the workplace and you are safe. Self-blame, guilt, or shame. Sometimes we think that we did something that agitates someone. Again, it's not one thing. It's an accumulation of things why someone looks at violence as a way to solve something. And then again, not understanding or recognizing what violence is. Hopefully now that you've been on this call, you now know that there are so many different levels of violence, and that if you trust in your gut that you are feeling unnerved by someone or uncomfortable, you probably are in a situation that is not comfortable to you and needs to be at the very least noted, and let your supervisor know of that as well. Or if it's at a very low level, you can say to the person, what is it that I can help you with, to change the subject to get them back into why they might be near your presence, or ask them to restate what they're asking or saying to see if they can say it in a different way so it's not meant to be intimidating or threatening. So, but again, that's done with very much of caution when you do something like that. So, I think we've kind of gone over this, but I'm just looking at it from a different angle. What is your role as an employee? First of all, if you are dealing with your own anger issues, take responsibility for your own anger. Get some help. We're going to talk about the EAP in just a second. For yourself, anticipate and intercept your anger and frustration. What do you do to diffuse yourself? What are your release valves? Is it exercise? Is it, going for a long walk? Is it fishing? What is it? Is it, typing furiously and then throwing an email away? What is it that you know that you can do when you get angry to calm yourself down? For yourself, pick your conflicts very carefully. Pick your battles, the old saying goes. Accept that there are going to be differences in the way management works, the way your company works, the way you think things are done, the way your coworker needs to be done. And that's what brings an organization together. If we had everyone doing the same, thinking the exact same way, there wouldn't be much progress. So those differences is what makes progress in our community, at work, in our relationships. The difference is how we deal with them. If you're in a coworker or a supervisor, praise instead of punish. Look at what someone is doing well. Remind them of what they're doing well versus punishing them. You have to correct someone. That's much different from punish. And then enlist the support to create a compassionate workplace. And that may be a big ordeal, but start small. Work with your coworkers to improve your own morale in your group, being kinder to each other. And I always use the word being respectful and civil. You may not become the best buddies with each person you work. You may not have much in common, but you can enjoy each other's camaraderie and the success that you have in the job and give each other support. And then finally, what is your role as an employee to prevent violence? We've gone through these a little bit, but don't engage in violent, harassing, or threatening behaviors. You to someone or accepting someone's behavior to you. Know what to look for and look for it when you're in a potentially violent situation. Report all the incidents to the proper parties, and we talked about how to find that out. And do tell your supervisor if you observe issues that might contribute to workplace violence. If there's a lot of frustration in the group, if there's something that needs to be fixed or a system that isn't working and it's been broken or not addressed for a long time. And then again, know what you need to do if there is a violent situation. Express your safety concerns to your management and leadership and use the appropriate channels to do so. Help make their work easier by making sure that that they get good information about what's happening at work. The more they know, the more that they can respond. And then you want to find out what your organization's plan is if there's an emergency or violent situation. I've already said that several times, but do make that a priority so that you know what to do and who to go to and how to react should you walk in on a situation like that. Okay. We're at the end of our training, so I want to just take just a second to see if there's any questions from the audience. Just give folks just a couple of seconds while we hear. Okay. One of the questions was how do we solicit help from the EAP, and then I also have a question that said, I think I might have missed something. Let's see. I'm going to read this question. I hope. Okay, I'll read this question and I'll talk about the EAP real quick. Our organization has a high level of bullying and harassment, and in more cases than not, they go undealt with by upper management when the employee who has been victimized is the person who has to continue with the bullying or harassment. When employees have sat in on EEO training, the employees go to the supervisor or manager and they pull the employee into a private room and give them a hard time in the form of bullying or harassment. I'm not sure what your question is, but I do hear your concern that the system that is in place right now is not working. Obviously, you need to work within the channels of your organization to let other people know of this. So whether it's a union or human resources or other avenues, so that corrections can be made. I'm still thinking about your question. It sounds like the person who felt bullied does have the right to tell management that they're feeling that they have been bullied or intimidated, but I'm not sure why an organization would not support that person versus victimizing them anymore. So, then the last question I had is, how do we get help from the EAP? You can contact us 24 hours a day by calling the number on your screen, 800-869-0276. Our calls are always answered by a clinician, and we'll give you a referral to a counselor, or you can get connected with work-life services such as legal or financial assistance over the phone, a consultation. You get up to 6 sessions of EAP sessions free of charge. It can be for any issue whatsoever, and those are confidential. And if you don't like calling, but you'd rather go to the website, just go to that website, www.eapconsultants.com, and it will ask for a member access information, and that is Interior EAP is what you would type in, Interior EAP. I'm just going to check all this real quickly and read through the questions, and I hope I answered them all. I'll stay on this for just a second longer just in case I missed a question, but I do sure thank you for your time, and have a good evening.